everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now today I'm honoured to be speaking with Rebecca Symes. Rebecca, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Thank you very much. I don't know about honoured, but it's a pleasure to be here.
No, I'm super excited. We've been trying to do this for such a long time. I often say that, but genuinely this time it's been like about a year and a half that we've been trying to get our diaries together. So I'm so thrilled and chuffed to have you on.
Thank you.
Well, let's get started by having you introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show, Rebecca.
So I'm Rebecca Symes, although I have recently got married. I say recently, about 3 weeks ago, we managed to get some kind of wedding off the ground despite COVID. And it's interesting from an identity perspective in terms of now thinking actually I'm probably not a Symes much longer, and really technically I am now a Levitt. So that's a new one for me to deal with. So yeah, currently Symes, but we'll be shifting over to be Levitt. Which is exciting. And yeah, I'm a sports psychologist, and I currently work for the FA, although soon to be leaving the FA. I've been there about 4 years working with England teams across the men's and the women's pathway. So I spent my first kind of 3 years with the men's under 21s, and some other work into the pathway with the men's under 15s, and also for these last kind of 12 months with the senior women in the Lionesses, which has been fantastic. Before that, I had my own consultancy, Sporting Success, and worked in a number of sports, predominantly cricket and Paralympic archery. So I had 9 seasons at Surrey County Cricket Club. When I first started there, I started off with the academy, and then I kind of progressed and ended up sort of the last 4 or 5 years doing kind of club-wide. Also with GB Archery with the Paralympics squad, so I was fortunate to go to London 2012 and Rio 2016 games with them, which was amazing. And various other sports. I spent some time with the Man City with the women's squad prior to joining the FA, which was great. Other kind of athletes, done some work with MMA fighters, which was good fun, some swimming, some athletics, darts, ballet, like a whole variety of kind of different things over time, really.
A veteran of 2 Paralympic Games. Favourite Paralympic moment?
I think it would probably be. Am I allowed a couple?
Go for it.
London 2012 was unbelievable. It was my first Games experience, and the opening ceremony for that Games was incredible. And the moment of kind of the parade and walking into the stadium to all the thousands of fans that were in there it brings me back now, kind of like spine tingling moments of just being like, nothing could prepare for that kind of moment of the cheers and the sounds that the crowd had for the athletes. And it was amazing for a Paralympic perspective to just the level of the support that was levied was incredible, and just to kind of be a small part of that was amazing. So that kind of moment of having the unbelievable privilege of being able to do that was incredible. I also think the moment when we won a gold medal at London was amazing as well. So we had a really tough games really actually in 2012, and we didn't go as we kind of had hoped, and we were, you're very aware in those scenarios when actually you're not hitting your medal targets that you've been set. So it was a really tough opening to kind of a Paralympic experience. So actually when we finally did manage to win a medal, and actually we had 2 GB athletes in the final, so they were kind of competing for gold and silver, so we kind of knew then we were guaranteed a gold and a silver. It's just a question of which way it was going to go. But that final, being involved in that final, and was an incredible moment. And Rio was amazing, but for different reasons.
Well, it's Rio. Hey, that's
exactly.
That's good in and of itself. You said something really interesting there that I've never really considered, because I've worked with Olympians. I haven't worked with Paralympians, but I haven't worked within an Olympic cycle as such. But you said something really interesting there, which is, obviously you were involved with the para archery team, and as things were progressing, you weren't quite hitting the heights that you'd wanted to, perhaps hadn't quite hit the targets. Is there can there feel like can there feel a sense of anxiety creeping in as perhaps the athletes aren't quite performing as expected? Is that something that you found? Is that something that as a group of coaches you had to manage, and perhaps you as the psych had to help them manage?
I think, I'll be honest, I probably hadn't anticipated for that, if I'm really honest. But absolutely, going into a game, like what your target is. It's very black and white in the Olympic Paralympic world. You kind of know what you're aiming for. You know what you're expected. You know what your targets are from UK sport. You know that funding is dependent on that ultimately. So, you're never going into a tournament thinking, oh, let's just see how we get on. It's very clear. And definitely, like that kind of experience as we progressed through the tournament, and athletes were getting knocked out, and athletes that you, I guess, had kind of anticipated had decent chances of medaling. Nothing is obviously ever guaranteed, and as athletes got knocked out, there was absolutely this sense of going, right, okay, well that's one of the potentials who's now not going to get a medal, or in some of the team rounds, because in archery you have team rounds as well. Or some of the teams were kind of getting knocked out, and there was absolutely this rising sense of, as each day goes by and people are getting knocked out, you're fully aware that the pressure then on those people that are still involved is mounting. And the interesting thing, and people probably don't realise this, is that the pressure then on athletes that are still in competition can rise, because ultimately for the programme to achieve their targets, to secure their funding, is dependent on a certain level of result. So therefore, as people get knocked out, the people that are still in, it's not just them that they're kind of competing for. They're almost competing for the entire program, and for athletes to stay on funding, for people's jobs to stay. So the pressure is potentially not just beyond what they personally want to achieve, but there's a bigger picture behind that as well. So that was a real eye-opener for me into kind of how the whole system works, really. And definitely the role of the psych. And I was fortunate that I was fully accredited, which means, you're living in the village, so you've got kind of 24/7 access. And absolutely there's times when you're sort of late at night, you kind of have athletes that might be suddenly thinking, oh my God, I've got this competition tomorrow, and they've suddenly realised this themselves, that the pressure is mounted, and, 10 o'clock at night, they're wanting to talk through it and, work through it. So this kind of world of sport, as we know, is never a 9 to 5. And the same with coaching and staff. And the coaches realise, actually, my job's on the line here, and actually, what does this look like for me? And I've got a family, and I've got kids, and how am I going to pay my mortgage? And yeah, that for me was like such an eye-opener that I just had not anticipated to that extent at all.
What's really interesting there is that notion of para archery being in essence an individual sport, yet you're alluding to a real team feel there. The pressure was on the team to be able to perform, a group of competitors, and then as the pressure built, because perhaps the competitors who were performing early didn't quite get the results, the others had to step in. So there was a real team feel there within an individual sport.
Well, that's where archery for me is fascinating, because you're right, it's an individual sport. So you've got the dynamic that you just talked about there, in terms of when other individuals perhaps aren't doing so well, other individuals that are still competing can kind of step up, and they're almost effectively doing that for the team. But there's also team rounds in archery. So, for example, you get a mixed team round, and when it was London, it's changed, but now I used to have different categories. You used to have 3 people team. They don't do that now, but they used to have 3 people team rounds. So actually what you would find is you would have individuals that in the individual rounds would be competing against each other. And then all of a sudden the next day, they've got to come together with the person that they may potentially have knocked out, in terms of even within the GB squad, because you've got GB athletes competing against GB athletes one day, and the next day you want them to function as a team. So the dynamics of that is complex. Again, when I sort of first started working in archery, and again, totally had this perception this is just an individual sport, actually there is a lot of different team elements to it as well.
Fascinating. I'm in awe of Olympians and Paralympians who strive to be the best in the world in these fine motor skills sports, archery, shooting. As the psychologist, you've talked about a team element there. What kind of psychological demands are there on those kind of sports, well, on para archery?
Yeah, I mean, like you say, that the sort of the precision, the fine motor skills, and therefore the ability to stay focused is absolutely crucial. The other interesting thing that I think is interesting with sports like archery and shooting is there is nobody else directly impacting on your performance. So it's not like football where you've got somebody else, or rugby, who's trying to stop you doing something. Nobody else is directly trying to stop you. But I say directly because it is amazing how other people do impact on the archer or the shooter or the athlete, because they've got someone else standing or sitting next to them. And in a competition, often the scores are displayed. So, you only have to slightly move your eyes to kind of think, oh God, the person sitting next to me has just had a really good round there. And then suddenly their performance gets in your own head, and they start to think, oh God, I'm not doing as well as somebody else. And then suddenly that whole comparison comes in. So whilst there's not a direct impact, there's absolutely an indirect impact of how other competitors around you were doing. And actually, from a psychological perspective, being able to deal with that is really important, because you've got to try and just focus on yourself, keep repeating your pre-shot routine, stay focused on that, have the ability between ends to be able to switch off, but equally not get distracted by what else is going on around you. So that also is a really interesting one to kind of wrap your head around, if you like.
Sounds so much like golf, but at the same time I remember shaking on the first tee at times, and I can only imagine how nightmarish that must be if you're an archer and you're shaking. I mean, it's just not compatible, is it?
No. And also, like, the equipment is again, I mean, I knew nothing about archery when I first started, but the equipment is heavy. The bows that they hold are heavy, so they're not, you've got the strength is such an important part of it. So yeah, that ability to kind of, and staying still and staying like focused is just absolutely crucial, because the slightest bit of movement, the slightest bit of shaking absolutely will totally knock your shot off. So.
Wow, incredible. Well, I'd like to make a shift here and move on to a topic that I'm keen to talk about today, and that's personal identity and athletic identity. And I know, having followed your work for the past decade, this is something that you've been passionate about, listened to you on other podcasts and read some of your articles, and it's really helped my understanding of personal and athletic identity, and how relevant it is in the sporting world, possibly more now than ever, and will continue to be. So I think to get us started there, identity in sport, personal identity in sport, leading to athletic identity. Bex, talk to me a little bit about this. What is identity? What is personal identity?
Well, our personal identity ultimately is really how we see ourselves and how we define ourselves, and to some extent the different types of roles that we hold. Going back to my opening about having just got married, my role now as a wife, I've got a role as a psychologist, I've got a role as a sister because I've got a brother, I've got a role as a daughter. We have various different roles that we hold in life, and how we feel we are performing, if you like, for want of a better word, in those roles, and how we match up to what the expectations of what those roles may mean to us, then influences how we feel about ourselves, our self-esteem, and our sense of self-worth. So our personal identity really is about how we see ourselves. And if we then think about that from a point of view of athletes, athletic identity really just refers to the degree to which someone identifies with the role of an athlete. So being an athlete, and how significant that is to them and how important that is to them. And there's a difference in terms of, if you think about it from a language point of view, let's say, if you were to say, I enjoy playing golf, that might be a hobby, it might be something you really enjoy doing, versus I am a golfer. So the sort of sense of I am really has this sense of signifying that that's something that you hold to be extremely important to you and has real meaning for you and has a real sense of your identity is wrapped up in it. I feel like that as in I am a psychologist. It's part of who I am. It's part of my identity, and therefore that becomes important to you, and that then starts to influence how we feel. It starts to influence our behaviour. So that in a nutshell really is what we talk about when we talk about identity. You obviously, in addition, you kind of got a team identity that kind of comes on top of that, which we can talk about later as well if you like. But yeah, certainly from an individual perspective, that's what we're talking about when we talk about identity.
So I've got an identity. I essentially play these roles. I'm a husband. I'm a wife. I'm a brother. I'm a sister. I'm a psychologist. I'm an accountant. We play these roles, and as you said, language makes a difference here. I enjoy golf. I am a golfer. That kind of language is going to make a difference to how we feel about those things in our lives, and I assume that's going to influence our behaviour. Would I be correct in saying that? So it influences how we feel, and you've mentioned the words there, self-worth and self-esteem, so how we feel about ourselves, and that must have a knock-on effect in terms of how we behave, the decisions we make around, say, golf or being a psychologist or being a wife or a husband.
Like in a really simple example, I used to play cricket. Because I enjoyed the sport. I've always loved the sport, and I enjoyed playing it. For me, cricket was never an identity from a playing perspective. So I used to play because I enjoyed the social side, really. It was fun. I enjoyed being part of a team and I loved it. If I had a bad game, it didn't really matter. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying I didn't care that as a team we didn't do well, because obviously you're wrapped up and you're part of a team. But for me personally, I wouldn't go home and it wouldn't have been the worst day of my life because, I didn't get any wickets, for example, because I'd still had a good time and I'd enjoyed it and I was playing at a level where, it was just social. But suddenly if your sense of worth and esteem gets wrapped up in what you do, then that absolutely has an impact on that, and it also drives our behaviour. So if you've got an identity where you are a golfer and that's important to you, then that's more likely to the amount of time and effort you put into that. It might not just be about what you do on the course, it might be the effort you put into your nutrition, the way you eat. If you've got, I don't know, if you're playing matches and you've got a game the next day, then even for someone that's an amateur golfer, they might make sure they go to bed and have a good night's sleep the night before. And so that's where it starts to drive behaviour in terms of your commitment to what you're doing, and in terms of how you view it and the types of practices, if you like, that you engage in that enable you to fulfil that role to the best of your ability.
I've written down 3 words there: language, feelings, behaviour. And there feels like, human beings are complex, so it's not this linear language. It didn't matter. Feelings, well, I'm fairly relaxed about it. Behaviour, the subsequent behaviours that you engage in. You said something really interesting there. You said, well, I played cricket and I played cricket. I didn't define myself as a cricketer. I did it because I loved the social side. It didn't matter if I lost. And then you kind of, not that you corrected yourself, you just said, well, it's not that it didn't matter, but it kind of didn't matter, essentially. It wasn't everything to me. And I think there's this interesting juxtaposition. Today I want to have this conversation around sort of almost like child and adolescent engagement in sport. And then, players who are well established, perhaps 18 plus college players into the professional ranks, and then career transition. If we begin at the beginning, there's so much language, so much extreme language around sports and around early engagement and around, I suppose, the professionalization of early engagement. And you said it didn't matter so much to me. And I just wonder if so many coaches are socialized into, well, it should matter. Bex, that's disgraceful. Why are you playing this? This should matter. You're letting yourself down, you're letting your teammates down. Why are you bothering to play cricket if it doesn't matter? What would your response to that be?
I guess that's where I slightly correct myself, because I'm I always like to say I'm not competitive. If you ask Nick, he would, my husband, he would tell you that I'm extremely competitive.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You play in team sport, you absolutely want to win. And if you don't win, you're always disappointed. But it didn't affect my self-esteem. I didn't go home and cry and have the worst day in the world. But I wasn't playing at a level where I was trying to be a professional cricketer. So for me, it was a recreational, social activity. Now, that's not to say that other people that do sports at a recreational level can't develop an athletic identity, because they absolutely can. I was using that as an example that for me personally, that wasn't part of my identity, if you like. But certainly what we see with youth athletes and athletes that develop or spend a huge amount of time in sport, and particularly when they spend so much time in one particular sport, their identity starts to become very connected to that sport. Now, there's definitely some advantages to that in terms of commitment. It drives an element of commitment because it's something that therefore becomes important to you. You want to get better at it because it has significance and has meaning to you. So therefore it drives that sense of motivation and doing, what behaviors that align to being better and improving at that. So all of that is great, and that's brilliant, and it helps people kind of stay committed from that perspective. And I've got no problem with that. That's great. The difficulty starts to come when athletes start to develop what we would call quite a singular identity, in that actually the only way they start to define themselves is on the basis of their sport. Like, I am a footballer, I am a cricketer, I am a golfer. And that's when we start to see difficulties. And often, not immediately, but it can come later, but sometimes immediately, because if your entire sense of worth comes from that sport, doing well in that sport, when you therefore don't have a good day, or, things aren't working well for you, that has a real impact on how you feel about yourself. And therefore your ability to be able to deal with mistakes, for things to go wrong, it becomes a lot harder, and it becomes much more of an emotional experience, because it feels like you as a whole person is then being impacted by that, as opposed to one aspect of yourself being impacted by that.
What I'm hearing you say there is, to a degree, having that athletic identity is, or can be, useful. I heard words like commitment, motivation, improvement, and how one defines themselves within their sport and the meaning they create within their sport influences those kind of things. And those things are important if I want to improve. If I'm a young player, 12, 13 years old, and I make a decision that I want to get really good at golf, or I want to get really good at football, soccer, or baseball, or basketball, whatever it is, then some form of identity there, some form of athletic identity can be helpful and healthy. But what I'm hearing you saying is either there's a double-edged sword there, or there's a line. There's a line, and sometimes we cross that line, and when a 13-year-old says, I am a footballer, I am a golfer, I am a basketball player, then we need to be mindful of that. Maybe as parents we need to be mindful. Maybe as coaches of young players we need to be mindful, because that can spill into an exaggerated reliance on doing well in those sports. And if I don't do well, then my emotions, my feelings, my sense of self-worth are going to be impacted, and subsequently my behaviours. Am I kind of summarising where you're at there?
Yes, great summary. Yeah, absolutely that. And ideally, we want to kind of have multiple identities, and we do have multiple identities by the very nature of being a human being. We do have multiple identities, but how much time do we spend recognizing the fact that we have multiple identities and thinking about what do we get from each of those identities? And so it's not just about, you don't just have to be one thing. So that's great if a young player identifies themselves as I am a footballer, brilliant, but maybe they play an instrument, or maybe they play another sport. So actually at that young age, maybe they are do define themselves as a footballer, but they might also define themselves as a tennis player, for argument's sake, or a basketball player. And what we want to try and avoid is what in, kind of in the literature we would refer to as identity foreclosure, which is when you start to close off other options. So, we want young people to have this sense of, look, it's exploration, go and explore lots of different things. Because if you become that sense when too young, you get this sense of identity foreclosure and other options start to come off, you start to develop actually this really singular identity.
You said the word recognise. I'm going to come back to that, but I just want to dwell on what you said there at the end, which was explore different identities and being concerned about identity foreclosure. Is there a tension there? Because young people are young people. Young people look up to, say, their role models, LeBron James, Phil Foden right now, Tiger Woods, and they say, I want to be a golfer, I want to be a footballer, and they start to really heavily engage in their sports. And there is, talking with Mark Williams recently, episode 107 of the Sports Psych Show, there's that tension between early engagement and specialisation, diversification. He did say early engagement is useful. The reality is you are building up practice hours that can make a difference, and there is some evidence to suggest that can be the difference between having a career as your chosen sports person or not. Combined with the passion that young people tend to have for their sport. So they themselves tend to direct themselves potentially into this identity foreclosure. There is some evidence from the research that suggests, well, we've kind of got to be a little bit choosy about things, and we do need to build up some practice hours. And yet at the same time, you're quite rightly saying, well, hold on, we need to be careful here because this can lead to maladaptive behaviours. There's a tension there, isn't there?
There is, but the way I always try and think about it and try and help coaches to understand it, this sense of like, they've got to be doing this, so you've got 100% focus. And I'm like, yeah, 100% focus when they are there. But they are not there, these players, athletes, are not there 24/7. So the point being, absolutely, if you're turning up to training, I'm not suggesting you want to be thinking about something else. Absolutely. When you turn up at training, you are fully engaged in that session, ideally. That's probably utopia because life events affect things. You know what I mean? You want to turn up and you want to be fully engaged in that training. And for that period of time, whether that's 2 hours after school, whether that's 6 hours during the day, whatever that is, you are fully engaged and absorbed, let's say, in that activity because that's really important to you. You're trying to, let's say, be a professional footballer, so you fully dedicate that time. 100% I agree with that. My point is saying, when these young people are not doing that, are they exploring other options? Not options necessarily career ones, but just mean other things, other interests, or actually is all of their time being dedicated to that one area? And I think that's the thing. It's 100% focus when you're there, but 100% focus does not have to be 100% of your entire life. So what activities do they like doing when they're not at football training, for example? What activities might they enjoy doing at other times that they can actually start to get a sense of, is it golf? We know lots of athletes also that aren't golfers enjoy playing golf, but can they start to get some interest in that? So it just gives them this broader range. So, they might have had a really bad day of football and actually they can go and release some steam by playing golf. Yeah. It's that sense of going 100% dedication to your sport. I'm not saying that's a problem. We know that if that's where you're heading, to be an elite athlete, it takes an unbelievable amount of dedication. But for these young people, we know that not all of them are going to make it. That's fact. They won't. So are we encouraging them to explore other things as well?
Well, coming back to that word recognise, and you've mentioned another word, exploration, explore. Do you feel it's incumbent on coaches and possibly parents to help their child or the players that they're coaching to start to recognise other things in their life? Do you think that's part of a good I suppose I'm asking two questions here really, because it's parents and coaches. Do you think that's part of good parenting and part of good being an efficacious coach, essentially, I suppose, is to help children recognize their identities, their multiple identities, and help them start to explore those identities?
Definitely. Yeah, I think we've got a responsibility. We've got a responsibility to do that. I really do believe that. And also part of it might be going, right, actually, as a, footballer, tennis player, whatever it might be, an activity I used to do with kind of youth athletes was getting them to think about, right, as a cricketer, because of the sport at the time I was working in,
Yeah.
like what skills and attributes do you have as a cricketer? So obviously you've got the technical side, but then you've got other areas like, actually your ability to deal with pressure, your ability to work as part of a team, your ability to focus, whatever it might be like, and those really help you. So let's think about how do those skills and attributes, how do they really help you in your cricket? And, you have a really great discussion about that. And I used to get an exercise where I'd get them to bring in a photo of themselves in kit, stick it on a page, and then we'd kind of annotate around it, or these days probably be on iPads, but you know what I mean, like that kind of exercise. And then you go, right, let's take those same skills, let's take the ability to focus, let's take the ability to be part of a team, let's take the ability to deal with some pressure. How does that help you in your life? So now let's think about you as a person. So let's get a picture of you just hanging out, chilling out. How do those same skills operate in your life in general, away from the sport? So even that exercise of getting young athletes to start to think about themselves as a whole person, not just as a cricketer, a footballer, whatever it might be, start to explore themselves as people and actually recognize that the skills that you have in sport can also help you in other areas of life. Brilliant, you can deal with pressure well. How might that help you at school? Okay, taking exams. How might that help you in life? Okay, taking a driving test. So can we start to recognize that some of these things that we already possess that really help us in sport can be applied in other contexts as well?
I love that, Bex, because I'm thinking their skills. I would also add the word characteristics there.
Yeah.
Just exploring your personality characteristics, exploring the skills, the attributes that you say that you have, having a good conversation around how that can help young people in their everyday life away from their sport. But I wonder actually if that can play to be an advantage towards your sport, because if you can take those characteristics, understand them more, understand how they diversify into your life and how they can be a strength in your everyday life, that can actually help you to develop confidence, and subsequently that can make a difference to your sport. So it comes back to your sport as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, it definitely does. And I think, and you mentioned it earlier, and I'm sure we'll come on to it later, but if we just briefly skip into the other end of the spectrum in terms of career transition for professional athletes, we know that lots of athletes struggle coming out of sport, and there's many reasons for that, but one of which is because when they've developed such a strong sense of identity connected to the sport, obviously when that suddenly disappears and you've no longer got that, it does have this sense of identity crisis around, well, what do I do now? So again, that exercise of going, let's not assume that just because you're not going to be doing your sport or competing in your sport anymore, that all of a sudden all those attributes, characteristics that you had are suddenly going to be useless, because they're not. How do we apply some of those to the next area of your life? How do we use some of those aspects that have really helped you and got you to this point and enabled you to have this amazing career? Where do they now fit in new avenues that you're going to be exploring, so that it doesn't feel such a worlds apart, and actually people that perhaps have had a successful is probably not the right word, smooth transition, maybe smooth is a better word, but in terms of, I think, have been able to recognize some of those skills and then, think about, well, how does that work? So I know players that have gone into business, for example, because actually, that the competitiveness, the drive, working in the city, the excitement of some of the stock markets, that kind of stuff, then feeds some of those same motivations. So I think that sense of, it doesn't always just have to be about, we've got to do something else and you can't, it's making sure that you've got what I would call like a rounded self-concept, so that you're recognizing how some of these attributes can be used in other domains.
Dwelling on that notion of being rounded, And, you're talking about career transitions there, and we are going to talk more about that. But from what you're saying, it feels like you as a practitioner will strive to start having those kind of conversations with athletes early or even midway through their career. And we're starting to dwell on the elite adult level here, but I think it's interesting for coaches of all levels. You've had the pleasure of working with players who will be in that adult elite category at the very top end of sport, where there's, I suppose, a great deal of pressure to perform. You've used that term rounded. And again, I'm going to talk about another, what I would describe as a juxtaposition here, to be able to compete at the very highest level. I think a lot of players, I found in my work that a lot of players, a lot of competitors feel that they need to be very single-minded in what they're doing and very intense about it. And this must play on this idea of athletic identity. Bex, Dan, well, I've got to focus. I've just got to, every single day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, I've got to be focused on my sport. I can't take my mind off of it because that's how I'm going to win the gold medal, or that's how I'm going to get in the team and stay in the team. What I've learned, or what I feel now, is that is an incorrect heuristic belief about competing. I wonder if athletic identity is compromised because people get competing wrong, that you can be more rounded and still compete. You've worked with some of the best athletes in the world. Would you agree? Would you disagree? Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, it does resonate, and it's a fine line, of course, because we know that athletes at the top level, what they dedicate, the sacrifices. Although we might not want to call it sacrifices because it's a choice, but we know what goes into that. It is not easy to get to the top. Hence the reason there aren't that many people that do it, because it is not easy. And it's not just about having talent, because we know there's lots of talented people who didn't make it. So there is that sense where absolutely you need an element. If we're talking about getting to the elite here, there of course is that element of dedication, focus, etc. However, I will still always argue that is not 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Psychological recovery is absolutely crucial. We put so much time and energy in sport into physical recovery. Like they've had a match here, right, and we've now got 2 rest days, or a recovery day and a rest day. We've now got so much effort goes into that. And I question, how much time do we spend thinking about psychological recovery? Because that is a huge element as well, and we really need to get better at that. And actually, that might involve switching off from the sport. That might involve, when you do have a day off, when it's scheduled, when it's appropriate, etc. Actually, what are you doing to get away from the sport? What are you doing to try and see family or friends that you miss certain events if you're at that level, you miss certain birthdays or special occasions. We know that happens. So when you do get the time, what efforts are we doing to really help and support athletes to be able to do some of those things? I worked with an MMA fighter who was really struggling with the fact that he was just so intense in everything that even when he got home, he just was finding it really difficult to switch off. And it's that element of going, if we can't help them to switch off, then that impacts on their recovery, and their ability to be able to be at the same level the following day and the day after that and the day after that is impacted. So when you hear people talk about the fact, well, for performance, actually I'm saying this is about performance. I'm fully on board that this is about performance. This isn't not about performance. If we want to be able to perform high levels consistently, we have to start thinking about some of these things.
What I hear you say there, psych recovery is about performance.
Absolutely. And I think that's where sometimes some of these areas can get a bit of a bad rap, if you know what I mean, because people think, when you start talking about these areas, people think you're suddenly taking away from performance. And I'm trying to say, no, this is the opposite of that. If you want optimal performance, that amount of time, consistently, you've got to start thinking about these things.
The word that comes into my head is guilt. That's what I experienced as a young golfer. That take a day off, the guilt would rocket through my body, and I'd be straight back out onto the practice ground, making myself worse, Bex, making myself worse, and that's the thing. And it's almost feels like, we're talking about part of our role, but potentially for coaches to deliver in this area, helping athletes to negotiate with themselves when it comes to this kind of stuff, to take a day off.
Definitely. What you made me think of there is coaches aren't immune from this either. Coach burnout is high. We know coaches are affected as well. So when again, if we're talking about at that top level, coaches are in this 24/7, and often, when the players have gone home, the coaches are still working, the analysts are still working, the physios are still treating, rehab players, etc. Actually, for staff as well, this isn't just about players and athletes, this is about staff as well, and looking after ourselves if we're working in those environments. Like, how do we, as performance staff, maintain that element as well? Because burnout can be high. So it's actually about anybody. A coach is still a performer. It's not just the players that perform. A coach is still performing day in, day out, game in, game out. So actually, sometimes it's not just thinking about players and athletes, it's thinking about the staff as well.
I completely agree with the coaches. It's, I am a coach, I am a football coach, I am a basketball coach, same sort of identity. As a coach, to be the best I can be, I have to work hard. I have to be on my laptop all the time. I have to be thinking about this all the time. I suppose, again, the same word guilt. Well, if I walk away from this, then I'm not thinking about the latest game model. I'm not thinking about the principles of play. I'm not thinking about how I can beat the opposition. And, there are characters out there. I mean, I can certainly speak for the world of football, soccer, who appear to be working 24/7. And that's an overwhelm of pressure on coaches. To be able to cut back their workload deliberately because they think there's other coaches out there who are working 24/7. But again, I wonder, we could take from basic neuroscience, and obviously there's a lot of debate about how the brain works, and not always a great deal of conclusivity, but, the sugars and glucose that are eating away when you're thinking about your coaching or thinking about your sport, and so your energy is depleting. They can't function creatively. They can't come up with solutions necessary because that front part of the brain, the intelligent part of the brain, is gone. That neural fatigue can really make a difference, can't it?
Yeah, massively. I think just stepping back a moment, you kind of the element of guilt. I think you're spot on. That's exactly what happens. There's this sense of guilt of if I do something else. But even if you took it away from sport and you put it into the business world or the corporate world or people's everyday life, simple things like, we know that people typically don't really, well, not typically, many people don't take a lunch break because they think they've got to work through and the workload is so high. But we know from research that actually stepping away from the computer, having a lunch break, making time to do something else, actually you end up being more productive. So even though you think, I sat on my laptop for 10 hours, yeah, but out of those 10 hours, how much was productive time? And it's the same thing in sport. But I think that sense of the guilt can be a real thing. And for me, that's where it's as much as anything a mindset shift of going, I need to view this time as performance. This is a performance choice. If we talk about performance choices, that's what we need to do. Actually taking rest, stepping away from that environment, doing something different, that is a performance choice. It's not I can't be bothered anymore, or I'm feeling a bit tired, and it's not this is a performance choice when we're talking about the top end. And that's the mindset people almost need to try and shift to. This is about performance.
I love that. I really do. It's a performance choice. I think that's brilliant. And you mentioned top end there. I also think it's, emerging elite athletes as well, especially them. I would also throw in practice choice. Because we live in this world, don't we, where, these memes come up on Twitter and other social media channels, and we see these motivational videos, grind, hard work, sweat, dust, blood, want it as much as you want to breathe, that type of thing. What we don't hear is variability, interleaving, representational learning, random practice, largely because it would sound pretty uncool. But obviously over the last couple of decades there's emerging evidence that actually those are possibly the main mediators, the main differentiators, and this notion of grind, well, we have to be very, very careful with language like that. And that seems to be where there's a little bit of a conflict, if you like.
Yeah, I think so. And I think again it goes back to those perceptions of what is expected of you, what's expected of an athlete, what's expected to get to the top, and it's all sometimes it kind of ends up getting up in this whole level of like, well, that's just the way it's done and that's what you have to do, without anybody ever stopping and going, but is that the way it has to be done? Why does it have to be done like that? Have we tried doing it a slightly different way? Have we looked at things from a different perspective? Yeah. You know, and it also feeds in a little bit. I've not mentioned, like when we talk about athletic identity, there's public side and a private side as well.
Okay.
And that's an interesting one in terms of like the private identity is like that sense of like in your own mind, how do you see and define yourself? So to what extent do you see yourself as an athlete in that example? And the public athletic identity is actually to what extent do other people see you as an athlete? And therefore, when you're viewed, particularly when you're a public figure, let's say, and other people see you, and then, you know, that whole concern then around, well, what will other people think that expect me as an athlete to act in a certain way and do a certain thing? How does my behavior then kind of get integrated with that? Because it's not just about how I see myself, but it's these expectations that other people are also putting onto me. So you've kind of got two aspects there.
That's really interesting, because I'm thinking there of an athlete's environment and how that influences their behavior. The behavior we see that they're engaging in might not reflect their private beliefs, emotions, etc. Privately, they might feel, well, you know, I want to be doing something else here, or I don't want to be constantly doing this, but they almost feel within this team environment maybe that, well, this is what we do here, this is our values, we grind here, which opens up another conversation about values, doesn't it, and the importance of those. But I suppose this leads nicely onto, again, this notion of who's responsible. Is the responsibility with the organisation and the coaches to be able to help create and guide an environment that allows athletes to be themselves, I don't love this term, but authentic, be their own private identity. Is it incumbent on coaches to be able to afford the athlete that opportunity?
I think if you're talking about responsibility, I think it's everybody's responsibility. We talk about that in culture terms as well. You know, sometimes the site get labelled, you've got to come in and you've got to change the culture. You're responsible for that. No, hold on, I'm not responsible for that. I can absolutely help facilitate that, etc. But everybody is responsible for culture. Everybody is responsible for this. This isn't just about one person taking control of it. And I think it's the same with this, is that sense of like, there's a responsibility on coaches, there's a responsibility on other staff, whether that's medical staff, whether that's, you know, there's a responsibility in other players to help other players. You know, we know that people listen, you know, particularly if we talk about adolescents, they listen to their peers far more than they listen to us. So can we encourage some of those conversations between peers? There's a responsibility on parents, there's a responsibility on teachers. You know, I think it's everybody. I don't think there's one single source of kind of sense of responsibility that has to drive this. But I think we've got to start by increasing the awareness around the importance of this area, and why it can cause problems, and because otherwise there's not the motivation necessary to kind of really consider it in the first place. But certainly I think the responsibility comes back to everybody. But certainly as psychologists, we have a role in helping and educating with that.
I want to finish here on this notion of transition. You've briefly touched upon it. As a sports psychologist, is this something that you're intentionally engaging athletes within a team on? Are you opening conversations with members of a team or the athletes you're working with who are, say, midway through their career or early in their career, to try to help them recognize multiple identities that can then go on and help their career transitions? Or is it a little bit more organic?
A bit of both, probably. I think it's, yeah, probably a bit of both, and it slightly depends on the context in which you're working and the age and stage of the athletes you're working with. When I think about the work I do with youth athletes, like 100%, I will always try and bring some of that work into it because I just feel so passionately about it. When you're working at the top end, I always try and have that sense of, dealing and working with the whole person, not just the athlete. I would never just work with just the player. And I think if you're helping a player to work on performance enhancement, let's say, you cannot do that without working on them as a person, in my belief. And I get really frustrated when people try and separate out performance and well-being, because you can't have one without the other. So it's not a question of saying, well, let's just focus on performance, and let's just talk about building confidence, or let's just talk about, you need to manage the pressure, or let's just talk about a strategy for penalties, or whatever it might be. That's obviously part of it. But if you're working with a player, you can't do that without understanding the context of their life, their family, their background, what's happening for them right now. So by very nature of probably the way I work, those conversations will naturally be occurring. So it's probably just built so much into my philosophy that they organically happen, as opposed to I have to make a real effort to make those conversations happen, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Now, it's interesting because you mentioned earlier on about, when you were a golfer, and if someone had kind of come along and said, well, you've got some other things, you've got to think about things, you'd be like, nah, I'm not interested in that. And it's really interesting that, because, there's definitely been players I've worked with who have got to the end of careers and suddenly thought, and have said, I've heard them say, if only I'd started to think about this stuff earlier. Only I'd started to think about some of these things. And it's an interesting time coming to the end of a career transition, because you naturally have the anxiety around what next, what's going to happen, what does this mean for me, what does it mean for my family. Actually, that sense of before the point at which your career has ended as an athlete, having given some consideration to what next, having developed some other skills that can help with that transition, can actually reduce the anxiety that you face in those kind of last few years, which then actually enables you to be freed up a little bit and enjoy and get the most out of yourself. Because at the end of, people talk about, it's interesting, like athletes, he's coming to the end of his career or her career. They're not as good as they were. Actually, if you think about an athlete that's coming towards the end of their career, many of them could be at their peak. Because to some extent, the knowledge that they've absorbed and all the rest of it just puts them in such an incredible position that this is really a stage to be celebrated and embraced. And, you want them to have that sense of total freedom at that point. So actually having done some work around actually what comes next and being prepared for that can help reduce those anxiety in those final few years. So that's, I think, really, really important as well. I don't want to open another can of worms, but there was some... it's just such a fascinating topic. But there was some interesting research out a couple of years ago that started to look at narratives of athletes and started to explore athletic identity a bit more in terms of, within athletic identity, is there a differentiation in that? And they started talking about the difference between almost like a performance-based identity and then a purpose-based identity. And the idea being that an athletic identity, which is very much, say, driven by high perfectionism, fear of failure, that real sense of your self-worth being totally contingent on results and how you do, is different to, say, more of a purpose-based identity, when it's actually being clear on what's the higher purpose. So, when you do work with a team, there's that real, certainly for me, of going, what's the higher purpose for this team beyond just winning? So absolutely, our ambition might be to win a gold medal. Our ambition might be to win a World Cup. But what sits above that? What's the purpose that sits above that? That might be inspire the next generation. It might be, to honour all the sacrifices that other people have made, that have gone before us. What's the higher purpose that sits above just the outcome of winning? Because that's an obvious one in sport. Everybody wants to win. That's why people are involved in it. But can we connect as well with the purpose beyond that? And that's the same for an individual athlete. What is it that you want to do beyond just the outcome side of it? And actually, if we can start to have some of those narratives and some of those, develop identities in that way, actually what the research is now showing us is that is better for well-being than just having this kind of sense of performance focus, if you like. And I use performance in terms of outcome. So outcome's a better word than performance.
I think that's really, really interesting. And as you're speaking there, I'm thinking about, rightly or wrongly here, I'm thinking about topping and tailing this notion of performance. You talk about purpose and aiming towards something. And as you say, it could be, and it's something bigger than winning. It's inspiring the next athletes or generation. It's something that's perhaps transcends us or bigger than us. And then I'm also thinking, when I say top and tail, I'm thinking of tailing of working on, say, the values of the team and the organisation, or the values of the individual. So we've got values and we've got purpose, and that feels like a very immersive process of helping athletes have a healthier approach to performance and driving their performance, rather than just got to perform, got to win. We're doing this for this purpose. We have these values, and these values relate to this performance. That's where my mind is going now. I don't know if it's gone off a completely random direction, but that's kind of what I'm thinking.
No, I think you're right. And I think, certainly teams that I've been involved with, certainly in recent times, we're big on trying to make sure we're clear on what the purpose is beyond just the winning. Mm-hmm. And I think that, again, going back to performance, that's important for performance, because, again, if people can have this sense of there's something, like you said the words there, bigger than just myself, that really helps. I think that really helps in terms of, particularly I think in terms of resilience and enabling people to manage certain situations, be able to have that sense of deal with setbacks, be able to navigate their way through challenges. I think that's really helpful for those kind of scenarios, without a doubt.
Fascinating.
I was just thinking there, and it's probably one for another podcast, and you may already have done it, and there'll be better people to talk about it than me. But we've talked a lot today about almost kind of like personal identity, singular identity, athlete identity, but we've obviously woven in some team stuff. But there's obviously also the whole of the sphere around kind of social identity and our behaviour when we're, just humans, we're often part of a group, and it's really interesting some of the the work around social identity. And one of my favourite, I can't remember when it was done, but one of my favourite studies in this area, you may be familiar with this, is like, and this is in a bridged version, but like when they had a group of Manchester United supporters, and they had them in a room, and they sort of were like priming them, if you like, by talking about Manchester United. And then they got them to move to another building. And they moved to another building, all in the Manchester United shirts. And on the way, there was an individual in a Liverpool shirt come along, and they tripped over. And not many people stopped to help that individual. They then ran this experiment again, where they again had Man United supporters, but as opposed to priming them with just talking about Man United, they primed them with talking about football in general. They did the same thing. They then got these people to walk to another building. Again, a Liverpool supporter comes down, they trip over, and much more people stop to help this person. Again, based on this sense of, it was what we call salience, how important is something at one point, and what at any one point in time, where are the salience level. So actually, if you prime someone around Manchester United, then the social identity, the group identity at that point becomes really strong just around Man United. If you prime them around football as a whole, then it doesn't matter whether, whatever team someone's supporting, if you're in that mindset of around these are just about football supporters, then you get a different response in behaviour. So that's probably just a complete and utter ramble, but I guess it's just also recognising that there isn't just your personal identity, there's also a sense of identity around the groups that we belong to, and we know that impacts. Football's a great example of that. People that support football teams, and when when their football teams win and lose, we know that impacts on people's mood. That's everybody's aware of that. So the groups to which we belong, and therefore our sense of social identity, is something that's also a fascinating topic to explore. I mentioned, sorry Dan, just to mention that word there about salience. I don't know if I can't remember if I mentioned it earlier, but salience is an important thing in terms of identity, because the greater, more salient something is to us, i.e. the more important it is to us, that's when the identity becomes stronger, and therefore we will, behave in ways that align to the things that are most important to us or the most salient to us.
So as coaches, we want to shift the salience away from, or the strength of salience away from the sport onto other identities?
I don't think it's about shifting the salience away from that. I think it's recognizing you can have more than one. I think it's more about that. So it's not saying let's take focus off this, but it's not so much that. It's not saying let's also almost expand the range of things we have, more so than somebody saying let's make this less important, because if something's important to someone, it's important to you, and it's going to continue to be important, and that's great. But can we also try and have some other things that have also got some importance, not necessarily equal importance, but have got some importance as well?
Increasing the sensitivity to other areas, insensitivity salience. And no, I you're it's a fascinating piece of research, the social identity theory research you mentioned there, and we have had on the Sports Site show, episode 17, Jeremy Holt and Dr. Will Thomas, and then episode 52, Dr. Matt Slater, talk about social identity theory, and it's
brilliant. I think the work that they've been doing is fantastic.
Yeah, it's so relevant, isn't it? And any sporting environment I've been in, competitive or otherwise, I find social identity theory to be really, really relevant. Bex, awesome. That's just been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Did we miss anything out? Did we cover everything to do with identity? I think we've done a good job there.
I think the only thing, and it's probably more in general than sports, but I think if you look at the there's, I guess, a fair amount of research and things that go in now to kind of understanding different generations of people. And I think one of the things that often gets talked about with millennials and the kind of the next generation after that, was it Generation Alpha, is it? I get confused with all the different ones, but it's the idea that actually, and this is more in general and away from sport, but the sense that actually now people's sense of identity is a lot more fluid than it used to be. And actually there seems to be a much greater sense that, and as demonstrated as well by the fact that people chop and change careers a bit more now and jobs, as opposed to 30 years ago when people had a job and it was the job for life kind of thing, and they stayed in that same career. But now there's this much more greater sense of actually we can be fluid, and teenagers, adolescents can be fluid and explore lots of different things. And I guess part of my thing is saying, how do we also make sure that we allow young people that go into sport to have that same exposure that other young people have?
Brilliant. Sounds like a topic for a follow-up.
Yeah, probably. Just another ramble there.
No, not at all. Awesome. Fantastic. Listen, Bex, I know you would have tapped the interest of the Sports Site Show audience. You are on social media. How can people follow you? And I know that you're also stepping back into the world of consultancy. So how can people get in contact? How can people follow you? How can people get in contact with you?
Yeah, so probably the best way is on Twitter. So my Twitter is @sportingsuccess. And like you say, I am going back into the world of consultancy. I had a fantastic 4 years at the FA. I've loved it, but looking forward to exploring some new opportunities. Twitter's probably the best way. I've got a website, sporting-success.com. So I'm just about to kind of redo that, as I realise my current one is very out of date. But so Twitter's probably the best way.
Perfect. Bex, thank you so much for your time.
No worries, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's great to speak to you.
Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to know what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me exactly what you think of the Sports Site Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.